Hello, welcome back. Today we're going to do a critique of Jeff Gariepy's position on the labor theory of value, as I already said in my last video. And today we're really speaking about a very important topic, which is the theory of value and certain subsets of theories that go with it. And we're going to look at it through the analysis of a position on it that is ill-informed and that is really inaccurate, and that reflects the lack of understanding of economics in general of JF. And I have to admit that this debate, as well as the debate he did with Bosch, really disappointed me, because I genuinely thought that JF had a certain beliefs that were a lot more accurate and a lot more grounded in reality than what I actually found. For example, in the debate with Bosch, he made reference to this theory of cultural Marxism, and he tried to defend there some, this cultural Marxist conspiracy, which is complete nonsense. And I can tell you this as a student in a fairly progressive university in NYU, and I actually study in NYU Shanghai, which is in China, which is supposed to be, a Marxist country. And even there, we were not force-fed any sort of Marxist literature or propaganda or anything. There are no classes on Marxism whatsoever. And not only that, but especially for us that study economics, we are actually force-fed the complete opposite of it. So academia is not a world ruled by Marxists who are trying to convince young people of their evil ideas in order to win some cultural battle against right-wingers. So that JF would defend this already disappointed me a lot. But in this debate with a Marxist that defended the labor theory of value, which, by the way, I am not going to comment on the position on the labor theory of value of the Marxist that defended it. I certainly do not agree with a lot of the things that he said, or a lot of the things that he thought that the labor theory of value predicts, or the labor theory of value is about. What I'm going to do is basically only comment on JF's position and what the actual critique of the Marxist economics is to that kind of challenge to the labor theory of value. Let me also point out that when it comes to JF's critique, I'm actually only going to comment specifically on his initial opening statement in the debate, where he laid out his critique. But I'm also going to make some references to other parts of the debate, although my main focus is going to be on that initial segment where he lays out his initial beliefs about the theory. And by looking at his critique, we are actually going to slowly discover that what actually happened here is that JF really overestimated his own understanding on the issue, even as a lot of the things that he said in that debate, he had access to the information that could answer those questions that he was positing there, as if it was the first time that he was, ever knowing about these issues with the labor theory of value, when in reality, and we're also going to see this, when I debated him in my initial statement, where I outlined the labor theory of value and so on, he agreed with me, and he didn't say these critiques against me. So what he did here is really he just laid out a set of things, a lot of which could have been very easily answered by reading the articles that I gave him, or by even skimming through some of the things said in a couple of those articles. Or he could have even just gone back to what I initially said in our debate, where I laid out a lot of the theory, or he could even go and check what I said to him in private in Twitter about the theory. But he didn't really do that. He didn't engage with the literature. He didn't engage with the actual arguments. He just went off what he heard from the academic agent and what he was hearing from the guy that said there, and that is a very poor way of doing any sort of scholarship. And it struck me, it really disappointed me, because he's supposed to be a PhD. So why would a person that is supposed to have, some academic achievements do such a poor scholarship so as to not even engage with the literature at all and just listen to what some people who had no expertise whatsoever on the theory had to say about it? So before we actually play the clips of JF making his arguments, let me say that from his initial statement, I got really two main critiques to the labor theory of value, one of which can be divided into sub-critiques. So on the first hand, we have a critique that is that the labor theory of value is essentially a tautology, that the labor theory of value doesn't add anything to our knowledge because it just states that labor has something to do with prices because it has something to do with costs, which is, of course, wrong, as we're gonna see. And second, his second category of critiques is that the labor theory of value doesn't explain a lot of the things that go on in our economy, that it doesn't explain the value of commodities. First of all, it doesn't explain the value of services. It doesn't of what he calls services. It doesn't explain the value of commodities that cannot be that are produced in a non-competitive environment, or commodities that are, or goods that are not commodities. So as far as this first critique about the labor theory of value being a tautology goes, let's listen to what JF had to say about it.
All right. So what we have here is a presentation of the labor theory of value, which I believe is true in some way. It's true like a truism, and it's not even wrong in some way. The statement that labor has something to do with price makes no doubt. Labor is a cost in the production of goods, and to the extent that some goods do require labor, they will respect momentarily, or they will be influenced by labor to the extent that labor is a cost. My point with the labor theory of value is simply to say, my expression that I just did in the last 30 seconds, that is all that the labor theory of value is. And what our friend here has presented to us is nothing else than a statement that labor is one of the costs that capitalists do have to pay to produce stuff and sell it on the market. That's a truism to the extent that it doesn't give us particular insight.
So as far as this first criticism goes, it is a gross misunderstanding of the labor theory of value that actually, I don't even know where he got this idea from, because when he debated me, I outlined the theory, and out of everything that I said there, none of it was this statement of, well, costs have something to do with prices. The labor theory of value doesn't say that there's some, relation between prices and labor costs. It doesn't say this. What the labor theory of value says is that abstract socially necessary labor time is value, and that this abstract socially necessary labor time brings about certain natural prices that are the centers of gravity of market prices. So natural prices are what explain the fundamental exchange value of commodities. And it is not a statement, again, of, well, there's some relationship. It says that labor times are what impacts the market price so as to be in their centers of gravity, so that if there is some movement apart from that center of gravity, there will be instantly a pressure towards getting in it in a competitive environment, which is the kind of environment that characterizes capitalist societies. But we're going to discuss this. But if we're speaking about capitalism, we need to speak about competition, because competition is a characteristic feature of capitalism. So if you want to speak about capitalism that is monopolistic and so on, then you and I are in empirical disagreement, because as the data shows, capitalism, even today, is still a fairly competitive system. So with competition being assumed, the labor theory of value holds, and empirically it has been shown to hold. But we're going to discuss this later on. So then, to conclude this first reply, the labor theory of value does not just suggest that there is some relation between market prices and labor values. It says that socially abstract, socially necessary labor time is what determines fundamentally natural prices, and that natural prices are the centers of gravity of market prices. And this gives us already a very important theory that can be empirically tested, and that it is empirically sound, not for a very small subset of goods, as we're going to see in our next reply, but this already gives us something that is testable. It's not a tautology, and it is actually a theory that says a lot more than many other theories that are out there, because it's not just saying that, well, there's some effect of supply and demand, because it accepts that supply and demand can temporarily distort market prices from their natural values. But it is saying that when market values stop being distorted by effects of shocks of supply and demand, what ultimately explains their fundamental value is labor times. And this is a very important theory, because from here you can get a big understanding of many other phenomena in capitalist societies. So it is not a tautology, and it seems bizarre to me that he would say that it is a tautology, given what I said to him in my original debate with him, and given that he agreed with it. So let's listen to what happened in our original debate to see what a change this is, and how I actually replied to him when he said, well, I believe that supply and demand influence prices. And I said, yes, so did the classical economists and Marx. So let's listen to this.
Yes, I do believe that. I think that...
Can you give us examples of those, like predictions that worked, or ascribing contradictions that have demonstrated to exist in reality?
Yeah, so if we begin from the very, very basic element of the analysis of capitalism, which is the theory of value, we can see there a theory that not only is it formally valid, but it's also empirically sound. And this theory was actually developed not by Marx originally, but it had been already sketched by Adam Smith and David Ricardo before him, who were, as you might know, two of the most important economists in the history of economic thinking. They were the founders of the classical school. And Marx was, in a sense, the person that culminated that school. After that, we had the marginalist revolution, and some of the issues that were spoken about, such as the labor theory of value, before the marginalist revolution, stopped being spoken about, and now a lot of economists subscribe to a different theory. But if you look at the basic theory of the labor theory of value, let me do a simple sketch. It basically tries to explain why do commodities exchange against one another in the way that they do. So they try to explain exchange value. And through the analysis of exchange value, they come up with a theoretical postulate that it's called natural prices. And natural prices are basically determined by labor times. And what the prediction was by David Ricardo already was that, so there's a mathematical refinement of this model that if you want, we can do, but I don't think it's necessary. But the basic predictions were the following. First, that natural prices are going to be very closely linked to labor times, direct and indirect labor times, and that market prices are going to be very closely linked to relative prices, to natural relative prices. And if we look at the data on this, we see that exactly the differences are very small. At the time of Marx and David Ricardo, they didn't have this data. They had very good intuitions, but they didn't have this data to get to this to prove it empirically, but now we do, and now this has been shown to be right. It's also been demonstrated that throughout time, changes in market prices are explained by changes in direct and indirect labor times. You also look at the relationship between these, and it fits the conclusion of Ricardo. And Ricardo also had a hypothesis that has also been proven right by a mathematician of the Courant Institute of Mathematics in my university in NYU, Jacob Schwartz, who basically took Ricardo's hypothesis that the element of the disturbance element, which for Ricardo was the profit-wage ratios, is going to have very small effect on market prices, on natural prices, and therefore market prices. And those the differences, if you look at what is the determining factor, you're going to see that there is a small deviation of 7% that Ricardo already pointed at this number, 7%. And this actually was proven right by Jacob Schwartz. So at the basic level, these are already three predictions of the classical theory of value that have been shown to be correct.
Well, I agree with that labor will influence the value of a good, of course. I think that the way I like to look at it is by simply understanding that the amount of labor required in the production of a good is ultimately part of the offer. And I think that the offer and demand framework allows us to not only include labor value, but also understand what happens with the market as it gets disbalanced away from the labor value. Would you agree with this?
Yes, and this was in fact also what Adam Smith, David Ricardo, and Marx also suggested. So they thought that the fundamental value of commodities was determined by value, which was direct and indirect labor time, and that fluctuations, temporary fluctuations in that, were caused because of effects of demand and supply. So in my channel, for example, I have an analysis of what happens in an economy where there's only two goods, oranges and deer meat. What happens if people suddenly become vegetarian and they only eat oranges? And what you see is that initially there's a fluctuation in price, in the market price, but that because if labor times, the ratio of their labor times is still the same, what you see is that they converge to a natural price. Market prices converge to this natural price. And this is a process that is a turbulent equilibration. This is what economist Anwar Shaikh has described as a turbulent equilibration. This is not the neoclassical conception of equilibrium as a state of existence. This is more of a turbulent equilibration that has periods of overreaction and of underreaction. So it's a lot more scientific and realistic in that sense.
Absolutely. I agree with everything I've heard up to now from you.
So now that we know that his first criticism to the labor theory of value, which he's going to say is not really a criticism because he agrees with this because it's just a tautology, but in the end it is a criticism because what he's implying there is that the labor theory of value doesn't really tell us anything new. And he actually explicitly says this. So we've already seen that this is actually wrong and that he had access to the information to correct him. And yet he went ahead and just stated that criticism there. Again, it's true. The person that defended the labor theory of value didn't do a particularly good job there. And he wasn't really defending a lot of the things that he should have defended. Or he didn't have a lot of the knowledge that maybe he should have had. But this is no excuse because in this specific point, I already commented on this particular thing and we already came into what I thought was an agreement on this issue. So he already knew that the labor theory of value is not just saying that there's some... So either he's deaf, he doesn't listen, or he doesn't want to understand what I said or what he has seen me write to him in Twitter and what maybe if he read the articles, what he read in those articles.
It doesn't even explain many goods, and there are thousands of examples. Academic Agent was raising the problem of shirts, jerseys from a particular university or a certain sports team. They are definitely not defined by the value of the labor. They obey laws that relate to identity, to just how much value people put in a trademark, to the fact that these trademarks are copyrighted and that other people are not able to produce. So already with the labor theory of value as it is claimed and laid out in front of us, we have an extremely limited insight into the mechanisms of market value. It really is telling us just a part of the goods that we are interested in, and it's those goods that would be mass-produced, potentially produced by other companies, and of which most of the cost, most of the value on the market is actually due to the cost of production, which in turn is due to the cost of labor. That is just a part of the goods of the market. To that extent, the labor theory of value is extremely limited in the insight that it gives you on human exchanges. So are hair cutting services, are they a commodity?
I don't know.
You
I don't think
don't
so,
know.
because there's not like a, I mean, there might be, I'm not sure, but there might be, I don't think that there's a freely reproducible good there, right?
I mean, you do, then you recognize that most of the economy is actually not described by the labor theory of value.
Well,
because we're a service economy.
So as we can see here, his critique is not only that the labor theory of value is a tautology, but also that it actually does not explain a lot of the goods and services that, are exchanged in capitalist economies, and that thus a theory that is trying to explain commodities, the value of commodities, but it cannot explain the value of a lot of the commodities that are produced and traded in our current societies, is therefore wrong, in the sense that it has what he says, a limited scope of analysis. And this is entirely wrong for a wide variety of reasons. And if we really wanted to crack open this particular criticism and get everything we can out of it, I would need to explain in very detail a lot of things, so I'm not really going to do this here, but I'm going to try to give a fairly summarized version of why this is actually wrong, because it's not easy to see firsthand why this is wrong. So first of all, we want to make a distinction that the labor theory of value makes, and that he doesn't understand that the labor theory of value makes, even though it was presented to him, that the labor theory of value makes this distinction between exchange value, use value, and value. So when the labor theory of value says that value is, the source of value is labor, it's not saying that price is the same as value. It's saying that exchange value in societies that have money as a means of circulation, as a means of quantifying the exchange value in terms of something other than purely just commodities of those commodities, that exchange value, that price, is not the same as value. Value is what determines, what is in a sense the center, as we've seen, the center of gravity of market price, of exchange value. And use value is also something that is different from exchange value and from value, because use value is essentially what the use values are, essentially those goods and services themselves. So they are those themselves without any exchange, without any, so the utility, the useful properties that they have, which turn them into objects of social use. And it is very, very important that we know that are objects of social use. And this is what basically are use values. And the use value of a commodity is not determined by its labor content. So this is not a criticism of the labor theory of value at all, as we've already seen in previous videos. And the market price, on the other hand, is actually going to be very influenced by the labor times, and in particular by socially necessary abstract labor time, which is what is in the Marxist tradition value. So when you say that the labor theory of value doesn't explain the value of a lot of commodities, in reality what you mean to say is that it doesn't explain the price of those commodities. But value in the Marxist tradition is socially necessary abstract labor time, which is the theoretical postulate that is presented to explain market prices. Second of all, it is extremely important to notice the difference between the producer of a determined good and the product itself. So these are different things, actually. And it is important to notice this because so in the Marxist conception of commodities, so commodities for Marx are defined as use values that have an exchange value. that are exchanged in the market. So that is a commodity, because if I produced a ham sandwich and I eat it myself, it is a use value, but it is not a commodity because it is not exchangeable. It doesn't have an exchange value. And Marx made it quite clear that in capitalism, labor power is itself a commodity because it is exchanged in the market, in the market for labor, against depending against some quantity of money that can be in the form of the revenue produced in that company or in the form of variable capital. And this is very important because although the labor theory of value is trying to explain through the labor content in those commodities why commodities exchange against one another in the way that they do, in the end, labor power is different, and it is different because labor power is the active ingredient in the production process. So labor power, although it is a commodity of a different kind. And so as far as I know, there are no empirical studies on the relationship between the labor cost of skilling a determined labor power and its market price. So far as I know, there's no empirical evidence on this, but this is not what the labor theory of value is said to explain, because Marx made it very clear that wages of workers are the product of the given stage of class warfare in a given point in time in capitalist history. So for Marx, wages were not determined in the same way that other the exchange value for other commodities is determined, because in the determination of wages there's a lot of struggle, and there's a lot of fighting from the hand of workers, and thus you find that, for example, increases in real wages can become stagnant, as we've seen from the 1970s onward, even though productivity increases linearly, because of a lack of negotiating power of the proletariat relative to the bourgeoisie, which in turn brings about this outcome in the labor market. So this is something different. So if the criticism of the labor theory of value is that it doesn't explain the value of labor power, on the first hand, we don't really know if it does or not, because there are no, so as far as I know, there are no empirical studies on this. Maybe there are. But on the other hand, it doesn't really matter, because the Marxists already have another theory for how wages are determined, which is actually empirically sound, as I've shown in my videos on inequality. And then it is important to keep in mind that Marx never made this distinction between goods and services, between the three sectors of the economy, the primary, the secondary, and the tertiary, that neoclassical economics makes. He actually made a different sort of categorization that is used by economists in order, by economists that are not neoclassical, in order to make their own empirical studies and their own classification of certain activities, which I am going to argue is more scientific because it takes into consideration certain aspects that neoclassical economics doesn't do. And the way in which he categorizes the activities of social reproduction is in 4 ways. He says that there are 4 categories, one of which is production activities, the second of which is distribution activities, the third of which is social maintenance and reproduction activities, and consumption. Out of those 4, only 3 constitute labor, and out of those 3, only 1, which is production activities, constitute production. And in production activities is where wealth is created, is where these use values are created and transformed. And it is important to keep in mind that in this production category, Marx included a lot of the things that one could now consider services in the neoclassical framework. So for example, a barber could be considered a productive labor under the framework of Marxist economics. Also, transportation services are considered to be productive because they produce the act of that use value being in the hands of the consumer, so they enhance the use value properties, the properties that make a determined object, such as, for example, a phone, produced in China. They enhance the properties that make that phone useful, because a phone in China is not useful for me. I cannot purchase it because I don't have access to it when I am not in China, of course. So if you're speaking again about transportation, it is a service under the neoclassical framework that is considered by Marx to be productive, that would not be, and this is again another important distinction, that would not be considered productive by Adam Smith or David Ricardo, because for them, use values and commodities were physical objects, but Marx corrected them on this particular issue, where he suggested that production need not be the production of physical objects. It was the production or transformation of use values which were material, but which need not be particularly physical objects. And this is something that the Marxists that debated JF actually got wrong, because Marx already went a further step ahead from what the classicals did do, and he didn't consider that only labor that is productive of physical objects is to be considered as productive labor. So here JF is in a sense, he's excused in not knowing this, because the person that he debated didn't know this, and he misled him into believing that this was Marx's particular position, when in reality it wasn't. But even with this excuse in mind, we have to notice that JF made his critique to the labor theory of value that said that it doesn't explain a lot of services before even this person said that only labor that is productive of physical objects is productive labor. So actually JF already went with this preconceived notion that the labor theory of value doesn't explain these kinds of services and so on and so forth. So this is actually something that it is important to keep in mind, because JF wasn't really understanding it before. And it is also important to keep this in mind, because when he says that the labor theory of value doesn't explain a lot of the things that are exchanged in the market, this is actually wrong, and this is one of the reasons why it's wrong, because once we look at the data and we look at the industries that are included in the empirical studies on the labor theory of value, we are going to see how industries that he would consider to be services that he said the labor theory of value doesn't explain are included in those studies and are shown to be consistent with the labor theory of value. But this wasn't the only criticism that he made, because he also considered other objects that were not services in his critique of the labor theory of value, when he said, for example, that following the academic agent, who is not an authority on the issue and who is not someone that you should take seriously when you are really wanting to research a topic like this, but keeping this aside, when he said, for example, he suggested that the labor theory of value doesn't explain the market price. He said the value, but again, he's meaning the market price, because he's conflating these two terms. It doesn't explain the market price of shirts produced by football teams or by basketball teams, where there's no competition for that particular shirt, and thus we see that the labor theory of value doesn't hold. Now, this is not necessarily true. I don't know in which study he found that this is inconsistent with the labor theory of value. I would like him to cite for me what is the study where he found this particular information. And second of all, the fact that in an instance where there is not competition between producers momentarily or for a certain point in time, the fact that this is the case doesn't mean that these commodities don't still have certain centers of gravity around them. The same way that if I, for example, I'm in space, doesn't mean that gravity in the Earth has suddenly stopped functioning, because what happens is that I'm just too far away from the Earth in order for the gravity of the Earth to attract me to its center. But this is not a problem of the theory of gravity, the same way that it is not a problem of the labor theory of value. Because in fact, what we see is that even in industries where there is a tendency towards monopoly, there is still a fair relation between labor times and the value of the output. So this is important because, for example, in the case of the oil market, in the classical tradition, it was already known that oil led to what was considered to be a natural monopoly, because its price is not only highly influenced by value, by labor time, but it's also influenced by the fact that it is extracted from a given set of land, and that land has a private property to it, and so it's very, very also related to the differential rent. So we expect in the labor theory of value that oil, for example, in the oil industry, the market value of the output produced in that sector would be slightly above its natural level, its natural prices, which are determined again by labor times. So this is actually found in the data, and this is quite consistent with the labor theory of value. And the same goes, for example, for shirts of basketball teams and so on. In the textile industry, as we are going to see in the data, fits the description of the labor theory of value, fits the empirical arguments that are extracted from the labor theory of value. So again, this is actually wrong, but because he's getting his information from the academic agent, he is leading himself towards a path that is misunderstanding certain things and being wrong, because you shouldn't take the academic agent as a figure of authority in this particular issue, especially if you saw his debate with Jack, where he demonstrated that he doesn't understand the labor theory of value at all. So it strikes me really as incoherent why someone would take his advice or his critique to the labor theory of value when this is actually wrong. And now we're actually going to see the important part of all of this, which is the empirical data. What do the studies done on the labor theory of value say about all of this? Is the labor theory of value applied only to a very limited amount of goods and services, or does it explain, as Marx already said that it would explain, the vast majority of the wealth created in capitalist societies? Well, now we're gonna see. So first, let's look at this book, Capitalism, Competition, Conflict and Crisis by Anwar Shaikh, where he lets us know what is exactly the method by which we can bring about this testing of the data and so on. And it's a really good book. It contains past explanation of many theories, and it builds a foundation for analyzing our modern economies based on the classical tradition and based on the Marxist economic thinking that I think is very accurate, very good, and that it certainly is a brilliant piece of economic work. So here, if we go to page 396, we find the following graph where we see data on the US for 1998, and we see data that relates direct prices to market prices. And that line that you see there is not a regression line. That line is the 45-degree line that tells you exactly the point at which these two values, market prices and direct prices, would be exactly equal to each other. So here, the prediction of the labor theory. Now, direct prices are the prices that are proportional to labor times. So the prediction of the labor theory of value is that these points that you see here are going to be very, very close to that 45-degree line. So market prices are going to be very closely linked to direct prices. And this data was taken from 65 industries. Now, 65 industries is a fair set of data to look at. And if we actually scroll down a lot of pages to page 867, where we find the sources and methods for this chapter, we see that the data sources and the list of industries used for this particular graph tells us the following thing. It says that the industry list, essentially comprised by 65 industries, is composed of industries such as farm, forestry, fishing and related activities, oil and gas extraction, and so on. And then you can also see in this list things such as air transportation, rail transportation, water transportation, again, all of which we would consider to be services, but they are considered to be production activities in the Marxist tradition. And we will also encounter certain things such as, for example, performing arts, spectator sports, museums and related activities, amusements, gambling and recreation industries. We find accommodation, food services and drinking places, other services except government, and so on and so forth. So again, look at this list of industries and find for yourself if out of all of these industries, you really think that we are not really getting a good grasp at what goes on in the economy by looking at the data on all of these industries. Now, which industries are being left? Now, I challenge JF to go through the list of these industries and say which industries are left in this particular study that he thinks are hugely important to the economy and that actually signify the fact that the Marxist labor theory of value cannot really give us a profound insight into capitalist economies because these industries are not included here and because, well, in reality, it's very limited in its scope. Because as far as the data shows, this is exactly what Marx was saying. It's commodity production encompasses a lot of activities, as we have seen here, and it is predicted that direct prices are going to be very closely linked to market prices. And if we look at the mean absolute weighted deviation between these values, we actually find that for this year, for 1998, it was actually of 0.145. Again, a very small deviation that is exactly predicted by the labor theory of value. So my challenge to JF is, now that you have the data, now that you actually have the list of industries, show it. Demonstrate what you said in your debate, that the labor theory of value is wrong because it encompasses a very limited amount of industries and that it doesn't explain anything meaningful about capitalism. It is just a tautology. It explains very little. So actually demonstrate this now. Go through the list, go through the studies, and say, okay, here is the argument. And to be fair to JF, I don't really expect him, when he went to that debate, to have read this entire book, to know exactly the methodology behind this, to have been familiarized with that data. So that is something that I really don't expect. But however, there is something that I think it's harder to justify, which is the fact that before that debate, I actually contacted him and I gave him the studies, other studies on the labor theory of value, where this list of industries is actually included, and he should just, the only thing that he could have done is scroll down, read a little bit of the article. He didn't even need to know a lot about the math and about the method used to bring about that particular study, but he just needed to look a little bit at what was the abstract and then look at the list of industries where it's listed exactly the amount of industries, the type of industries that were included in that particular study, and then come to the conclusion that the labor theory of value is in fact applicable not to a very small subset of things. So he could have done this with the information that he already had, that I had provided him, and yet he didn't do it. So to demonstrate to you that I am actually not lying, that he could have found, although not with the same amount of detail and as in this book, but with enough detail for him to come to the conclusion that that criticism that he was about to present in that debate was actually wrong, that he could have found this in one of the studies that I sent him, which is this study done on China, Japan, and Korea, where the name is The Monetary Expressions of Labor Time and Market Prices, where if we scroll down, we see, well, first of all, we see that the data is consistent on all of these countries, is consistent with the Marxist labor theory of value, and also he could have gone down to the list of industries used to see that there were industries such as, for example, water transport, air transport, real estate activities, financial intermediation, education, health and social work, other community, social, personal services. So again, he could have, in fact, seen this had he had the the honesty to actually look through these articles, even if it was like skimming them, because I spoke to him very shortly before he actually made the debate, so I don't expect him to actually go through the entire thing and know everything, but had he been interested in this enough so as to actually look a little bit at the conclusions, look at the data, he would have found that only with a very short look at these studies, at not even all of these studies, at only one of these studies, he could have already seen how the arguments that he was going to present there were actually wrong. So I repeat my challenge to JF. Go through these studies, go through the list of industries, either the one that I presented in this in the book of Anwar Shaikh or in that study, and tell me which industries are missing there that you think are so important so as to signify that the labor theory of value really doesn't give us a good grasp into capitalist economies. And I have to note there that in this article, the list of industries is actually shorter. It's only about 33 compared to the 65 of the book, because a lot of the activities that are divided into different industries, some of the activities that are divided into different industries in the book are actually considered all in one in the study. So the difference really is not that big if you look at it in gross terms. And with all of this being said, it is important to keep in mind also something else, which is that he claims that the labor theory of value doesn't explain a lot of the things, that the labor theory of value is really just a tautology, and he doesn't really provide us there an answer to these problems. He doesn't really give us what he takes to be the theory that actually explains this better than the labor theory of value. However, he gives us a hint into what he thinks is the best theory when he says that he would like a different theory that encompasses not only the supply side and the labor cost side, but also the demand side and so on and so forth. So let's listen to this.
That is one thing. So I prefer a theory that encompasses labor, time as one of the costs, and that can also explain other things. Such theories exist, theories based on demand and offer. Once you understand that labor is just one of the factors, one of the costs in generating an offer, then you understand that the labor theory doesn't tell you anything else that the neoclassicism would tell you. It simply puts an unjustified focus on labor as a cost. But in fact, it's not always the case even that labor is a cost.
So here what he calls neoclassicism is actually something that the Marxists, again, would not be against. We say, as did David Ricardo and Adam Smith, that in the end, if there is shocks to demand or supply, there will certainly be proportional shocks to market prices, and that thus there would be certain deviations from natural prices. But however, if we eliminate these effects of supply and demand, what we see is that the market converges towards a given natural price, as I shown in other videos when I spoke about, for example, the economy with two goods, with oranges and deer meat, and a consumer base that actually becomes vegetarian and that doesn't want to consume as much deer meat. So if his theory is that prices are determined in the market and that supply and demand influence prices, then no one is against that. No one is against that. That is not a problem for the Marxist theory of value, and this is something that we agree with. However, if what he means by this is the neoclassical model that you have in the screen right now, of these two curves right there intersecting at a given price, then he might want to know that this doesn't explain anything, right? If he thought that the labor theory of value explains few things, this actually doesn't explain anything at all, because these curves don't really exist. And as Paul Cockshott already showed in this video, these curves are actually against Leibniz's principle of having as few free variables in your model as possible. And it is true that there is some good intuition in these curves, but in reality the curves don't explain anything, because we don't know exactly what's the shape of those curves at any given point in time. We just know the point in which they supposedly intersect, which is the price and the quantity at which commodities are sold. That is the only data set that we have. We only know at which point there is an interaction between supply and demand. So we don't really know exactly what are these curves or anything of the sort. This is simply a graphical representation of a set of intuitions about the market that are not necessarily wrong, but it doesn't really tell us anything. The only theory that actually gives us a good grasp at value is the labor theory of value. So again, my criticism consists first of pointing out that JF didn't really understand this, and challenge him on what he thinks are the industries that are missing in those studies, and then what is his proposed theory that is actually better than the labor theory of value. Because if his theory is that supply and demand have effects on market prices, then the classicals and Marx already said that, so he's not presenting anything new. He's actually the one that is not presenting anything new. So this is pretty much it for this video. As we've seen, things are always more complicated, normally are more complicated than what they seem when you look at them for the first time. So if you really want to get a good grasp at something, if you really want to scientifically study something, you cannot just go based on first appearances. You need to dive deeper. You need to look at the fundamental aspect of that which you are studying. You need to focus on a lot of things, and this is a very complicated issue that is not as easy to solve as he is setting it there to solve it. So again, this is really my intention in this video, is once again to show that things are more complicated than what they might seem at first glance, that you cannot just go based on what your intuition tells you at first glance, or what you heard the academic agent say in a debate where he demonstrated that he doesn't understand this issue, because what you're going to do in the end is demonstrate to others that actually understand what you're talking about that you don't know what you're speaking about, and you are there even as we've already interacted in the past, and I already explained to you what the labor theory of value is, the prediction that it makes, and there is actually not a tautology. And well, I didn't say in the past the amount of industries that were included, but now this is something that I've said, and in the articles that I linked him, this is something that he could have perfectly seen. So look at things more carefully. Don't jump into conclusions that are precipitated, and if you do, be willing to accept criticism. So this is the next part. Is JF going to accept this criticism? Is he going to admit that he was wrong on the issues where he was wrong? Is he willing to accept the challenge that I presented him? Well, I don't know, but if he does, I will be glad to hear it and to entertain that response. So anyway, this is it for now. I hope you enjoyed this content, and I will see you in the next video.